I think there is such a thing as loving something to death. And it's a strange circle in many senses, because this thing that we're going to talk about that we've loved to death was on the verge of death until people started loving it, and now it's being loved to death again. But it's also sort of circular because this particular thing is the symbol of circularity and resurgence. So today we're going to be talking about the ajolote, or as people know it in the English-speaking world, the axolotl, because of this funny Hispanic thing, funnily enough, where the J and the X were interchangeable for a long time. There's a big debate over whether a far-right Spanish politician should be able to write Mexico as Mexico with a J, but that's a different subject. Today we're talking about the ajolote. And the reason I talk about loving it to death is because it's been a subject of conversation throughout the lead up to the World Cup, because it has become the symbol of the Mexico City government's sort of logos. The axolotl is everywhere, from the billboards that promote the city to the actual official seal of Clara Brugada's government, the mayor of Mexico City, to the concern of a lot of public safety officials, actual physical roads. So they've painted on the roads massive axolotls. They look beautiful, but people say they're a distraction because they put them right at crossings, really dangerous crossings. So you're looking at the sweet little axolotl as you drive over a pedestrian. So there's been a lot of debate over the ajolotización of Mexico City, the axolotlization. Oof, that's a mouthful, of Mexico City. But I think there's so much more to the axolotl than this sort of cuddly, cutesy little creature. And I was hoping you could tell us about it.
Did you mention that it's on the 50 peso note now?
No.
It used to be like, we grew up with José María Morelos y Pavón, this great general of the independence movement, and they changed it to the ajolote a couple of years ago. There's a concern in the Mexican Central Bank that an enormous chunk of the 50 peso notes that are supposed to be in circulation are not in circulation because people are just collecting them instead because they're really pretty.
It's the monetary equivalent of the Beanie Baby boom. Everyone's convinced that the axolotl note will be worth a lot more, but it is still only worth about 50 pesos, or exactly 50 pesos, some would argue.
Yeah, that's because there's literally tens of millions of them currently collected, let alone those in circulation. But anyways, what is this axolotl, ajolotl? Well, it's an animal. It's an animal that only exists in Mexico. It comes specifically from the Valley of Mexico, where current-day Mexico City stands. But its name actually goes back all the way to the Aztecs, and that's where you have these funny sounds, A-X-O-L-O-T-L, axolotl. What does it mean? Well, the most obvious meaning seems to be water dog, a dog from water, because xolotl means dog, atl means water, great, but maybe not. And here's the tricky part. Xolotl, or xolotl, everything in the name without the A, is an Aztec god. And this Aztec god is amazing. Xolotl is not really like a first-rank god. This is not, Zeus equivalent. This is not god of the sun or of war. But he is a god of a lot of things. And here's quite a collection. He's the god of fire and lightning, which seems to make sense. He's also the protector.
How is lightning and fire not a top-tier god?
Well, he's sort of like the protector of things that are related to the major gods. Because he doesn't control the sun, he just controls like fire and lightning, for example. So he's a protector of heavenly fire, which also sounds pretty crazy, pretty cool.
He's basically Zeus's bag holder, or whatever the equivalent of Zeus is in the Aztec world.
Exactly. And it's like in the Greek pantheon, you have Zeus, and then whatever his name is, the guy who like makes things, he's the god of smiths and so on. Same idea. It's Hephaestus. But as with the pantheon of any of these gods, sort of things that are associated with a god are quite quirky when you start looking into it. Fire and lightning. Then, just to throw that into the mix, he's also the god of death, the dead, and, why not, the resurrected. Seems like, two big groups of things to be in charge of. But the Aztecs said, that's not quite enough. He said, while you're dealing with the dead and the resurrected and the fire and the lightning, you might have some downtime where you might want to play hide and seek or something of the sort. So you're also the god of games.
He's the Marco Rubio of the god world. Just everything. Just give everything to this guy.
And it doesn't stop there. He's also the god of everything that's monstrous, everything that's deformed. And I don't know what this says about what the Aztecs thought of twins, but he's also the god of twins.
Well, we know what the Aztecs thought of twins, which is they were sacred, but in a sort of terrifying way, because in the same way they treated albinos and other sorts of basically differently abled and differently looking peoples, they were seen as messengers from the gods, and that often resulted in sacrifice.
And you've hit the nail on the head, because that's what's really interesting about Xolotl. Xolotl is basically a link between the divine and the natural world, the earthly and the otherworldly. He is able to sort of travel between worlds. He's also in charge of, he's in charge of the underworld basically, but also he's in charge of taking the dead to the underworld. And in line with that, there are two animals associated with him. One is the dog, which he's also the god of dogs, by the way. And dogs, as we know from Coco, the Disney movie, dogs are very important to the Aztecs primarily because they're our companions not only in life but also in death. They help us on the journey to the other world and stay with us in the other world. But there's another animal also associated with Xolotl, which is the axolotl, right? So it's really interesting to me that this god is the god of everything that is otherworldly, everything that is different in some way or another, that they view as exceptionally special. And of all the very many animals that live, and more importantly lived, in the Valley of Mexico when the Aztecs were around, and there were a lot of them because it's a massively biodiverse place, this particularly important god gets only two, the dog and the axolotl. But I think it's particularly interesting because it shows that the Aztecs already 800 years ago had a very clear sense for how special the axolotl was. It was clearly otherworldly. It was special. It was different in some way, because otherwise, why would you ascribe this particular creature, this magical creature, to this magical god that represents and is represented by everything that is unique and special and different?
Is it because it lurks in the depths of the sort of murky, muddy water of Xochimilco?
I think it goes actually way beyond that, because in the same way that Xolotl had the ability to transform into other things, and Xolotl was the connection between a world and was the god of everything that is different and unique, the axolotl is incredibly different and unique. And for this reason, people have become obsessed with him now. Now, part of the reason, to be fair, that people are obsessed with him is that he's incredibly cute. If you've ever seen these creatures, they come in different colors and shapes and sizes, but the one people like the most is a sort of like white and pink one, and they have like an eternal smile on their face. So they're like quokkas. I don't know if you remember this animal from an island off of Perth in Australia that was famous for a while because it's eternally smiling. Well, this is the underwater version of a quokka.
And I guess we're not that different from the Mexica, from the Aztecs, because one of the things that really struck me is the logo from the Mexico City government, and every other version that I've ever seen of an axolotl is this pink, cutesy version. Looks like a Pokemon, basically. And the funny thing is, apparently, that's a rarity. It's actually not exactly what you would find in nature, because that's an albino. Which, again, it makes us actually a lot more like the Aztecs than we thought we were, because this is us glorifying a very specific sort, a very specific genetic variation of the axolotl, when the one that you'd find in nature is the sort that would be camouflaged, the sort of dark green, brownish, black salamander that camouflages with the lake bed mud, whereas we love the beautiful pink, bright one, which would definitely die in the wild, but which we have glorified in our own pantheon.
Exactly. And just by the way, it looks like a Pokemon because there's a literal Pokemon that was created inspired by the axolotl. But yes, like the one that we're all obsessed with and the one that people really like the most is this pink and white one which is extremely rare. The normal one, let's say, the one that you more commonly find, is not that attractive. But let's not focus on that. But the axolotl is particularly beloved not just because it can be exceptionally cute and it has some sort of mythological background to it, but it seems that the Aztecs had discovered that it was special in the way that we now know it to be special, because it is one of the creatures that scientists today, particularly in the realm of medicine, are most obsessed with. That is because the axolotl has quite a few really interesting abilities. Now, we all have heard of the fact that number one is when they lose their tail, and they might actually chew it off themselves, can grow it back. So plenty of animals have an ability to grow back certain limbs. The axolotl has an ability to grow back limbs and a bunch of other stuff. It can grow back parts of its heart, part of its spinal cord, even some of the non-essential parts of the brain. Moreover, it can take organs and like eyes and limbs from other creatures, other axolotls, and just sort of glue them onto himself and be like, well, great, I've got one of these now.
What? I didn't know that.
It's amazing, right? So, of course, now that we're all obsessed with like living forever, apparently, axolotls has become really interesting because one of the big problems that we have is that our cells begin to age and they start losing the ability to regenerate and stay young and healthy. That is not a problem axolotls face quite as much. Of course, they're not immortal, but they do have the ability to regenerate in a very, very impressive way. So they're widely studied for these regeneration ability. It's widely studied in stem cell research, and it's also widely studied for cancer resistance.
This reminds me a lot of the conversation we had a few weeks ago when we talked about chilies and how even though we mostly relate to chilies when it's in our food, it's actually also an essential ingredient in the investigation of its other components, so like anesthesiology and all of that. And this reminds me a bit of that because it's part of this wonderful smorgasbord of biodiversity that Mexico brings to the table and that allows us to discover new phenomena, but also new cures for different diseases and all that. And therefore, I'm assuming what you're about to tell me next is the fact that the axolotl is therefore incredibly rare because it's endangered, because we've destroyed that biodiversity.
How did you know? That's what's incredibly sad. So the axolotl is technically very close to extinction. It's critically endangered because we think that there might be as few as 50 living in the wild today. Some estimates put it much higher. We're talking maybe 1,000, maybe slightly more. But even then, that's a tiny number, right? However, there is an enormous number of these creatures out there because they live not only in aquariums, because they become really popular. As we mentioned, Pokemon had an axolotl-inspired Pokemon. Then in 2021, I believe it is, Minecraft comes up with its own sort of Minecraft version of an axolotl. Diego Rivera has them. I think it's in the Cárcamo de Dolores, which you mentioned in the Chapultepec podcast. I think there's an axolotl there because it's a water creature. Julio Cortázar, apparently, the famed Argentinian novelist, wrote a short story where the whole story is about the axolotl, how someone becomes obsessed with it and becomes one in their mind. So we've always been obsessed with these creatures. So they're in aquariums all over the place, and now of course we're obsessed with them for medical reasons. So they're in research facilities all over the planet. But where they're supposed to be and where there used to be a hell of a lot of them, there are now only maybe a few hundred. These creatures, of course, came from the canals around what is modern-day Xochimilco. But more broadly, we can't be certain, but we believe that they lived also in all of the lakes, such as the Lake of Texcoco, the Lake of Chalco, which are pretty much gone.
We must remind our listeners who aren't from Mexico City, all these lakes are embedded in the valleys that surround Mexico City, or that make up Mexico City now, the dried lake bed. And the only thing that really remains is the lakes of Xochimilco, where these famous floating gardens persist. And that's a teeny tiny fragment of what used to be this massive, basically inland sea, and is now relegated to the far south of Mexico City, these pockets of water.
So to that point, today we believe that the axolotl lived in a space of maybe, if it's really lucky, about 1,000 hectares. Maybe a lot less than that, might be about 200 hectares, which is a very small space, particularly compared to the fact that it used to live in an area of about 150,000 hectares. So, as you said, Alex, much of what is modern-day Mexico City had all these lakes, which, or inland seas, as you call them, which, when the rains came in the summer, would swell up, and these lakes would become connected again. But then, in the course of the winter, as no rain would come, they would start drying out, and they'd become separated again. But the axolotl was able to live and thrive in all of these sort of different environments of relatively fresh water, relatively salt water, canals, rivers, and lakes.
So let's get this sort of picture of rarity really ingrained into our listeners' minds. So what we've got is a teeny tiny fragment of the ecosystem they used to live in, which was already, despite the fact that the lakes are massive, it's it's a pretty limited space, right? There's just one valley in the middle of Mexico, which is now limited to a tiny fraction that is now known as Xochimilco. And because of all the pollution, all the partying, I'm afraid to say, all those boozy drinks chucked into the water has made it very difficult for the axolotl to be able to. And furthermore, even if you looked and found an axolotl, there is a chance you wouldn't even recognize it, because even though we're used to these sort of beautiful little frilly animals, it turns out these frilly animals are in this interesting stage of their life, the larval stage. They're basically tadpoles. What's fascinating is most of them won't turn into this sort of final stage, the sort of from the tadpole to the frog, but a lot of them will. So you might find a bog standard salamander that will look like something that isn't an axolotl, but actually is one. What's interesting is the fact that they evolve into this new form, to use the Pokemon terminology, is actually quite rare.
And actually, the reason why you would generally not find them in their, fully evolved, last Pokemon stage, let's call it, is precisely the reason why research professionals in the medical industry are obsessed with this creature. Axolotl is able to do something which is quite odd in the amphibian world, which is that it can reach full sexual maturity without going through the metamorphosis that they're supposed to as amphibians. They can just stay children forever, basically. Scientists believe that the fact that they can reach the sexual maturity without the metamorphosis is because their cells remain in this sort of perpetual embryonic-like state, which is precisely what allows them to regenerate in this particularly extraordinary way. They're sort of perennial babies continually forming, such that when they lose their heart, they can still regenerate again.
So this is like the salamander equivalent of your aunt who's dating a 20-year-old, trying to get that sort of young cells attached to her and live forever.
Really, thank you for that, Alex. I hadn't thought of it that way, but now I've got that in my head.
This is you're the one who brought this up, because I didn't realize that they could stick other bits of other axolotls on themselves.
That's wild. And then sometimes they also do these incredible things where, like, say they lose a limb, and then they're able to like regrow it, right? But in the process, they might grab another limb and stick it on. So now they've got 2 extra limbs, because you might need it again. Now, the problem for axolotls is not just that we've destroyed their habitat in an extraordinary way. We're talking of, less than 0.5% of their original habitat in a best case scenario still existing. But we're really attacking them from every possible angle. There's massive pollution, as you mentioned, Alex. It's not just, yes, it's a big chunk. It's not just a bunch of drunks throwing themselves and their vomit and their alcohol into the waters of Xochimilco. But quite importantly, Xochimilco is still an important agricultural area, and it's a relatively impoverished one. Relatively, because obviously it's within Mexico City, so it can't be that impoverished. But being relatively impoverished, you don't have the sort of very cutting-edge agriculture that is, more focused on regenerative agriculture and taking care of the land. You get a lot of old-school 1970s, use as much fertilizer as possible to get as much volume crop as possible. And these fertilizers are killing the environment more broadly, but the axolotl specifically. And if that wasn't enough, we've also decided to bring in a bunch of fish that are not native to these waters, and they like to eat axolotl. So it's not a good time for this lovely creature.
Are they particularly susceptible because they absorb quite a lot more from the water directly from their skin, sort of like their gills?
I didn't know that, but that would make sense. Yeah, and the water in Xochimilco is actually, it's not just that there's pollutants in it, it's not just that it's toxic, but it's also the chemistry of the water itself is changing. So the ratio between potassium and nitrogen in the water is basically wrong. And there's a lack of oxygen in the water as well. So it's basically an almost lifeless form of water. So, if we're supposed to breathe oxygen to stay alive, this creature that will take oxygen out of the water, well, this water is not healthy water. So it's basically not able to breathe.
So is the axolotl destined for the way of the dodo?
Well, this brings me to something that you said in your eternal wisdom, Alex, about 15 years ago, which really stuck with me, which was when a country's national symbols, its national animals, are doing poorly, that really does say a lot about the state of that nation. I remember the time you were talking about the quetzal in Guatemala, talked about the Mexican eagle, the royal eagle. We talked about the bald eagle in the U.S. in the 1970s and 80s. And the axolotl, I think, is very much a symbol of Mexico City in that way. It's become a banner of Mexico City. Yay, woohoo. And on the one hand, we're doing exceptionally well at keeping it alive. Because back in 2013, they did a big census. They couldn't find any. So they basically said, well, maybe this means that it's over and done with. And then a few days later, they found 2. So with that, they were able to extrapolate and say, oh, actually, it's still here with us.
Well, we've looked everywhere. Have you looked there? Oh, yeah. Never mind. Yeah, they're fine.
Sorry, I was out for tea, basically.
Like the day later. I love the idea that the scientists are doing this incredible millennial trope. They're like, they're nowhere to be found. And then an awkward pause, like, he's right behind me, isn't he?
Exactly. Yeah, they're doing the documentary, and then the axolotl just kind of swims behind them. This reminds me of Alice in Wonderland phrase where I don't remember who was telling who, but basically they say, it's great that you're running really fast, but if you want to move beyond the point that you are, you're going to move a hell of a lot faster. We're doing a lot of work to keep this creature from going extinct because there's so much momentum destroying this creature that just keeping it alive, just preventing it from fading altogether, requires an enormous amount of work. In order to allow this creature to thrive once more, for it to reach, sort of a stable number of axolotls that will move it away from being in critical danger of extinction, we need to do a hell of a lot more. Now, a lot is being done. So there's, for example, a lot of work with semi-permeable biofilters made of volcanic rock and other, local material that will help or is helping to sort of clean the water and that these creatures can survive in semi-protected areas of Xochimilco, but still ultimately in Xochimilco with cleaner water. You can adopt an axolotl, actually. There are campaigns. They started with the UNAM, but there's plenty of non-profits that are involved in this. They all are obsessed with saving this little creature. But I think the most important thing is being done, but a lot more of it needs to be done. These sort of more holistic solutions. One of the things you get a lot all over the world, and particularly in Latin America and definitely in Mexico, whenever someone says, oh, we should do this thing to protect an animal, you get this response of, there's so many other bigger problems, like, the authorities should be dealing with something else. And yes, partially I agree. Drug dealing and drug war is probably a bigger issue than the axolotl. But stopping these animals from going extinct, and then allowing them to thrive, the solution behind that is often linked to a much broader set of problems. So as I said, an enormous reason behind the disappearance of the axolotl is the fact that we're pouring very toxic amounts of fertilizers into the soil that seeps into the water and is killing them.
It's part of this incredible detachment that often city dwellers have from nature. They see the biosphere as beyond them, whereas actually we still live within a biosphere, even in Mexico City. People often forget that more than half of Mexico City's area is actually a protected forest and wetlands. So I can see why people feel detached, but also why actually the air they breathe, the water they drink is still very much coming from those hills. And to help those hills regenerate is very much, sure, to the benefit of the axolotl, but the axolotl is really the canary in the coal mine or the salamander in the swamp. It indicates something that's going terribly wrong and that will ultimately really affect the rest of us.
Exactly. In the case specifically of Xochimilco, a lot of work is being done, but a lot more needs to be done, where farmers are taught how to transform their relatively antiquated and pernicious farming practices into much more modern, regenerative, environmentally conscious practices that can give them a good living while they protect the biosphere, and they protect the ecological system of which they're a part of, and that gives them their sustenance. Some work is being done, for example, by chefs in Mexico City who are trying to focus on, are part of this sort of eat local kind of movement. They're like, well, let's get all of our vegetables from Xochimilco and Milpa Alta.
I thought you were going to say they were cooking up the axolotls.
I mean, that would be one approach. But no, they're helping agriculturalists in Mexico City take up more sustainable practices, and these are ultimately helping to keep Xochimilco from basically dying, and this is helping the axolotl to come back to life and thrive once again. But will this ultimately be enough to save Xochimilco and thereby save the axolotl from going extinct in the wild? Remains to be seen.
Well, I hope it'll go the way of the panda, which is endangered for a while, massive symbol, big push to save it, and now they're basically a plague in China, as far as I'm concerned.
You heard it here from Alex Gonzalez.
Yeah, making enemies one country at a time.
I'm Tavo Figueroa.
And I'm Alex Gonzalez Olmrod.
And this is Mexico, the podcast.
Every 2 weeks, we're talking to you about the critically endangered beasts that populate this fair land called Mexico.
Subscribe to the Mexico Political Economist for this and many, many more stories.